Hello, it's Tuesday, and this is a little bit unusual for office hours. This is really more of a public service announcement in its way. I take some time every semester because people get really excited by the folks that I am incredibly privileged to welcome into the space of my class, either to ask, how do I join your class? I would love to visit your class, which we love to see it. But also folks who are really interested in, um, as fellow teachers, how do I get in on this action? How do I invite people into my classroom? And I wish I had really good responses to either of those questions. I'm much easier to say, well, yes, everyone is welcome in my class. And if this is something that your skill set potentially lends you to do, or your company potentially kind of would like to be involved in the conversational community built by this class, there are absolutely opportunities. So I can start with that first, and then I'll transition over into answering questions that I've gotten and possibly that might show up in the chat in terms of how to proceed if you are someone who is either studying tabletop and actual play or looking to include it in your courses and might want to find class visitors and what the logistics are, how my particularly strange situation works, but also how, it might translate to your context. All of us are teaching in different circumstances. Heck, every time I teach this class, it's so very different. But first, a little bit about this class. I teach a tabletop class, sometimes two, every fall as a general rule, and I have since 2021. I've taught this class under this course number in the English department in 2021 and here in 2023. And in 2022, I taught a course as an honors research seminar, so a different unit in my university, as well as a graduate seminar in Austen adaptations, which focused on A Court of Fay and Flowers, in addition to literally all of the works that Austen wrote before she died, and a bunch of Austen games, which are super fun. And there's lots of them. And I can speak forever about how great that is. And indeed, if you boodly boop over to the other parts of our YouTube channel here, you can see other resources as well as the vlogs for the Austen class in particular. So, what that means is often people are getting really excited about the possibility of participating in the class at 2 points. Hopefully, we've got some folks showing interest in our mid semester, which means that when I carve out very intentionally class time at the end of the semester, usually the last couple of weeks, I leave kind of constructed. And that isn't necessarily to stack the deck with visitors. It is to listen to students at mid semester, think about what their essays are trying to do, what research questions they have, what final products they're creating, and figure out different ways for us to use class time efficiently, either to do critique, to do further reading or playing, or indeed to ask a few more people to class. And that's what actually this week is about. We actually pushed us a week's worth of assignments back because Matt Mercer had availability between being at New York Comic Con and playing to 11,000 people at Wembley Arena next week. So thank you, Matt. And this is exactly kind of what you can reasonably anticipate, those of you who are thinking about this in terms of inviting folks into your classrooms, is if you get a yes, you're very likely to get a yes on a very short time frame if you're asking people who are booked and busy and whose lives are portfolio lives, which is to say that they are built around different kinds of the minute gig labor, or kind of have very tight controlled schedules. People are likely to know in a short window of time if they can pop on a Zoom. But let's put that to a side for the minute. I'm still talking about you, you lovely human being who might want to join my class as a class visitor. And really, there's two kinds. One is in person, and that's new this semester. Most of my guests have been in person, which means we have scheduled them months in advance. Almost as soon as the class is on the books, I'm going around putting out feelers. And the first thing that you'll see me do on my socials is ask folks, hey, who's going to be in the Atlanta area in the fall or the spring or whenever I'm teaching the next tabletop class? And because we are 90 minutes down the road from Atlanta, that means that, for example, if you're coming to Dragon Con, you might be a really good fit if you've got some time either before the con or after the con to make the trip down 85 towards Auburn University. That is how Josh Simons became our first guest. Was he knew he was definitely coming as part of his work for Demiplane to Dragon Con. We knew that months in advance, and so we could get him on the schedule. This is also how Ned Donovan came down, who originally intended to be at Dragon Con, but was ultimately here for auditions. So the vast majority of the folks who are coming to my class in the year of our whatever 2023 are people who are already going to be in the greater Alabama, Georgia area, usually Atlanta, for work, or for some other reason. Christina Ariel, waiting for you. Remember, you have an open door. Christina is from the area, as actually many actual players are. And so, folks like Taylor Moore, who would be coming home for a family visit, also slot in really nicely. That is the next layer. And so, Zoom attendees of the class aren't usually planned way far in advance, because if we're planning in advance, we're hoping to be able to, like, have funding align, and logistics align so that we can bring you all the way in, right? But there are some people who are super duper duper booked and busy, or they're just not gonna ever be in the US. And so that's where Zoom meetings come in. I teach in a class that is wired for sound and for video, although generally speaking, if we have a visitor these days that's totally remote, for example, today with Matt, I come home to my home office, which is kind of more COVID safe. I don't have to wear a mask. We don't have the noise of air purifiers. And honestly, I can have my camera on and be making something approaching eye contact with our guest in ways that the camera doesn't really allow me to do because of the way that cameras are situated in our classroom. Basically, if you've visited my class remotely in the hybrid period, that's Kate Welch and Jeff Stormer, and other folks. Basically, there's like a creepy overview of the whole room, and no one is looking in the direction of that camera. So the guest is getting a camera angle from me and the backs of all the students' heads. It's kind of a mess. And so at this point, that hasn't been my preferred version for if a guest is remote. Instead, we build it into the syllabus, and some students are indeed going to be in the classroom where we meet, all kind of, on their individual devices with headphones. Um, and that's a personal choice. Students have that room if that's the best for, like, they're moving between different classes. Some students stay home. Some students are in other places. Generally speaking, it works. We usually also ask guests if they're willing to have that meeting recorded. We haven't recorded in person meetings up to this point, but we do record virtual visits pending the approval of the guest, never to be shared publicly unless the guest requests it specifically. And there's one example here on the YouTube channel for that. So it's really because even with remote, we still have students who are unable to attend class for any number of completely legitimate reasons. And so, when possible, we try to make that recording available. That recording auto destructs off of our servers. I retain a copy on my personal hard drive, but it's not in the cloud. for a super duper long time. 180 days is when Auburn University kind of nukes its Zoom records. But I keep it, as part of the kind of background research. And reminds me of talking points when I have conversations with people in future. It is not material that I use in my research directly unless I already have approval from the subject. If we're having that kind of relation, then I have a formal interview process that's separate from the students. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, people are much more inclined to be candid to students than they are to other kind of entities, especially if I'm wearing my like Polygon hat. Polygon, weirdly, this is a kind of aside, but it's worth noting as especially for people who are interested in like how do you get access to people. Well, one way that I build trust is that I write for a public publication, and I have a social media presence, and I have this YouTube channel. To the extent that anybody watches this YouTube channel, there is currently one person, and I like you. Hi, one person who's watching this live. um, but the key is I write for a publication that often asks for interviews as part of the pitch that freelancers are writing. So I often have occasion to talk to people in that space, usually about stuff that's under an embargo. For a certain amount of time, and people are avoiding spoilers, and people are assuming everything's on the record, and that is wise. If you are talking to somebody who has their journalist hat on, or and they are a professional journalist, you should absolutely be indicating what is and isn't on the record. I'm primarily a professor. And as a professor, I have a kind of different kind of duty of care to my research subjects. So I shove way more kind of into the memory hole in those kinds of ways. So I have a formal research process for interviewing that is separate from anything that happens in my classroom. And so people feel like they can be reasonably candid with students who are, young folks, that they don't want to, they don't want to mislead them, which is really lovely and honorable. And this is one of the things that I look for when I'm talking to people and kind of mulling over what's the right combination of people to invite to a particular version of the class. I've never had the same person twice, it's worth noting, and that's partly availability, and that's partly, kind of the shifting nature of the class. The first time was really capacious in terms of lots of different kinds of games all the way to video games. We contracted really heavily down to the analysis of actual play in my research methods course last year. And then, of course, I had an Austin class, which, of course, means a very particular kind of focus. And a kind of this version of the class was kind of doing a deep dive on systems. So I was really interested in people who either, work on VTTs or are pushing against the system or that sort of thing, or who are designing games themselves in addition. And also, honestly, it's the people that I have working rapport with, either from having met them before or having a virtual kind of conversational, sustained interaction with. So, to give you some examples, I've worked with Ned Donovan on the New Jersey Web Fest, which involved a lot of back and forth in terms of judging and things like that. I've Josh has mentored several of my students up to this point. So he hadn't been asked to speak to the whole class, but I knew that he had been a really generative source for individual student researchers. Um, Gabe Hicks, I've worked with in the flesh on projects and continue to do so. I've had productive virtual conversations with Taylor and Matt, more with Taylor, it should be noted, than with Matt prior to visit. So sometimes you're having a visitor who you've not actually had a like even Zoom to Zoom kind of dialogue with, which is can be a little bit scary. Not because anybody involved is scary, but you're not sure how the vibe's going to go. You're not sure what's how this any of this is going to play. So that's part of this as well. And so I go to places like Big Bad Con. I keep in the loop on whatever socials are kind of in play. Um, And I get some really lovely messages and emails from people who kind of say, volunteer either their team's time. I just got a message from Evil Hat on Blue Sky. Paizo has been in contact, and it just hasn't been the right time to have that connection made, just in terms of what we've been doing and examining. Individuals will send me really lovely messages, and I keep those all in a file, because often what's happening is that they're not coming in mid-semester, but they're coming very near the end. So for example, um, a lot of people are excited today because we've had two fairly high profile guests, and we're actually closer to the end of the semester than you might think. The challenge at the moment is that we are well past mid-semester, because for those of you who attend PAX Unplugged starts like the day after my last day of class every fall. Which is one of the reasons why people are like, "You want to go to PAX Unplugged?" And I'm like, "I don't know how I can," because it's literally the weekend between the end of classes and our exam week. To give you, so in other words, we're kind of coming to near the end of October now. A lot of stuff is already structured and in the can, so to speak. And we kind of have all of Thanksgiving week off and 1 week after Thanksgiving, and that's all she wrote. So the folks who are really generously offering their time and expertise, it may be that they're a really good fit for an undergraduate researcher to individually interview, or it may be that I have to file it away until the next time I teach, which, it should also be noted, I'm spending a lot of my time writing grants so that I can write a book, because which would mean doing what we in academia call buying out my time, which is to say, getting a lot of money from different funder sources, be it internal or external, that allows me to not teach. And as much as I adore teaching, especially this class, it's come to be the time where I need to sit and write a lot, and punctuate that writing with field work. I need to go to sets and observe. I need to interview people in person who are more comfortable being interviewed in that space. There's a lot of work left to do with the kind of actually the majority of the percentage of my contract that I do in bits and pieces in between teaching. And teaching is really important to me, and I want to do it right. And so when I'm doing it, while I'm lucky enough to teach my research every fall, so far. That also is still, kind of breaking up my time in ways um, that allow me to write little bits and pieces and little chunks. And now it's time to put all the chunks together. So the other thing you should know is that it's entirely possible that next year won't have any teaching on my deck as at all. And so instead, I'll be doing those kinds of formal research interviews and conversations with people in the field and the community, but may not be inviting. So if I'm not responding and saying, "Hey, yeah, let's do it right now," it's in part because the semester is almost over, and I literally do not know when I'll teach this class again. There's always the possibility that my institution just decides that this is not a thing that they want me to do, for whatever reason. Very unlikely. Last year, the my request to teach this in the English department was no go, but the honors college is always looking for humanities research classes, and so was able to do it there. The other thing is that in addition to the the kind of just am I teaching, is this semester was particularly unusual in the sense that I had um, money that I had gotten from an internal teaching improvement grant to pay for folks to come over and to stay in hotels, or at least get a small honorarium. Um, in one case, pay for the plane ticket as well. And so it depends year to year and class to class whether I have those resources also available to me. I try to mine the institution, and I'm very lucky to be at a wealthy institution that allows me that kind of funding. And this is, I think, where we start to transition from how to join the class, which is like, hey, just send me a message and I'll keep you on file and I'll let you know if there's a time that we need you, and that it fits. And that might be a while. So hold on, hold your horses. Um, but we're starting to talk about the how you as an instructor potentially can have people come to your class. And so I want to start this part with a little bit of a story. I had a really bright young graduate student, not at my institution, message me a little while back, and it's really stuck with me. They were really excited about formulating their master's thesis. For those of you who don't know, master's programs tend to be about 2 years, so it's a pretty short window of time, and it's usually the second year. Maybe a little bit before that, but not much when students are formulating a project for that. So we're talking about a tight timeline here. And the student was asking me about how I got interview subjects in the hopes that they might be able to emulate that. And so I said a couple of things to that student, and I hope they weren't upset with me. And I hope that they feel like they can come back and ask more questions if it serves them. But basically, what I said was one, I'm in a very unusual scenario. I have a long time to build trust. So let's not forget that like that a lot of the folks that have talked to me, um, you know, have been seeing me do this work or hearing about this work that I've been doing for several years now. And it was 2 years after I actually wrote my first article on Critical Role that I even started teaching the class. So I've been at this for basically 5 years at this point and really visible in the space for three. So that's already like way longer than a master's program. It's almost longer than a doctoral program. So we have to kind of scope what we can do. We're also in a very different place than we have been in the past. So, very famously, Robin Hope got in real early with a master's thesis, the very first one on Critical Role. Matt Mercer read it. And that was back in the very first year of the show when, the world was not as fraught and overstimulated, and there weren't literally millions of followers and viewers of Critical Role. Um, Even I would not necessarily make that ask, myself these days. Certainly, there's lots more plates spinning in the air. So we're all be every year is different for all of us because of the media landscape and because of the kind of changing nature of the labor. Um, Also, these things take time. Also, for many folks who are doing this research, including inclusion in the classroom, we have an enormous amount of interview material that I recommend that you take a look at, if especially if the person that you're dreaming of having in your class is really high profile. Um, the higher the profile of the person, they're high profile because they've been interviewed any number of times. So the other challenge to having a high profile person is asking questions that don't immediately send them into an answer that they've given many, many times before. And I've done enough interviews at this point, like as a interviewed subject, to know when I'm clicking into that headgear, like that headgear, that mind frame of, oh, you want the origin story of how I became a nerd. Here's the story. And this is a story I've told many times because it is a kind of commonplace of TTRPG um, interview programs. And that's not bad because each of those is often reaching a completely different audience. The people who are hearing it are often going to be hearing it for the first time. But I've said it enough times that I can tell how it's becoming more polished, but also some of the interestingness is kind of rubbing away every time I do that. So, my challenge that I put to my students is, can you, with this person, introduce productive friction? Can you ask a question that's not personal, not inappropriate, not comic-con-y, but that is something they haven't heard before, or haven't heard in quite that way, or that gets them to stop, think, reorient, and do the thinking out loud, right? This is what I try to do as a teacher, right? I don't want a rote response from my students or a brainless response. I want that moment of, oh, I have to stop and think, and hopefully we've built a space of trust where the thinking can happen out loud. And that's also the goal when we're interviewing people and we're doing these kinds of class visits. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you have to ask the obvious question. Every one of my class visits starts from, "You were my student's age, and now you're somewhere else. Talk to us about the path." And for some people, that's the very first time they've been asked that question. But for most people, we've got a story about our origin stories in that kind of way. But it is a useful place to situate us all, to ground us before we keep moving forward into, possibly challenging or in depth or whatever kinds of questions. So the other thing is that those are hard questions. Those are gems of questions. And so one of the things is that some of the really good questions have been asked already. And you can get those answers. Like if you're talking about somebody who's been on Dimension 20, chances are they've been on Adventuring Party or sorry, Adventuring Academy. Drop out. Seriously, why do you have two shows that are basically the same name and they're both connected to Brennan Lee Mulligan, y'all? Come on. I know there's nothing to be done, but there you go. But the key is that Adventuring Academy is a really good source for students to listen to stuff. Um, Many of those are freely available. Um, D&D Beyond does a lot of good stuff. I don't know that I would ever ask Matt Coville to come to class because I think that I don't know. I One, he's just got a whole wealth of his thoughts, on the internet already available in digestible form. My students use running the game all the time already, and I don't know, I think that would be one where I would have to already kind of have a better vibe sense of when the friction would be too much and would lead to a shutdown. That's just one example, right? So it is unlikely that any of us will always have a kind of productive ability to easily slip into a kind of colleague mode. You only you know yourself in that respect. Um if you know you're gonna like fanboy, fangirl, fan person out super hard, you really don't wanna do this, as an instructor. If you think your students can't get over that cliff, I mean, my students, um, are great, and they are super duper excited, some of them, but they're also highly socialized and extremely polite, and so we're able to kind of with a lot of encouragement and a lot of kind of pre-prepared discussion questions that had come from prior discussions where I framed it as, "Oh, that's a really good question. You can save it for Matt, Gabe, Taylor, whoever." That I think that's really, that's a good way to kind of prepare your students in that kind of way. But it's a real soul searching to kind of think about your real own relationship to celebrity because if it's just a cool person came to class and you can't get to the humanity, then the learning's not going to happen. So there's that. So yeah, so for super high profile folks, the TLDR of it all is you may not need to, um, and you may not want to, um, because there's a lot of logistical over. The power is weird and tricky. Even though everyone is, but people are normal, they're just busy. But the busyness is itself becomes its own like kind of bugbear in that kind of way. So, but I do actually recommend that you involve the tabletop field in your classes. All of that said, because there are an enormous number of rising folks, as well as people who are just plain interesting to talk to. And you get a vibe from this from socials. I forget who said this to me, fairly recently, but, like, you can get a certain level of vibe from people on social media. It's not perfect, and it's not everyone's everything, right? Um, what I'm doing right now is I am in teacher professor mode, and you're not seeing, the pajama pants I have on, or, the Dr. Pepper off camera. That doesn't mean that what you're seeing is inauthentic. It just means it's curated, right? And we all do this. Our teacher personas are very much curated. Actual play personas, social media personas are often curated in the same way. Hello, Akash. Welcome. And so, basically, I think the thing to take away here is that you can start to listen to how people present themselves in these kinds of spaces, who's having the kinds of conversations in productive and generative ways that feel like they might be interesting to bring to your class, who's making the kind of new and interesting small games. Because I'm a big proponent of bringing indie games into your class, bringing those games from itch.io, bringing one pagers, bringing pay what you can, play testing stuff. Far more than, you can teach Dungeons and Dragons. God knows there's an enormous amount of apparatus that Wizards is providing, especially for K through 12, for that work. And you can make that choice. I personally don't, generally speaking, because other people are doing it quite well, and for a lot of other reasons that are probably beyond the scope of talking about speakers per se. But it does connect to what we're talking about here because indie game designers are so smart and so thoughtful and so intentional about their work, and they are far less likely to be completely overwhelmed with being perceived and demands on their time. Now, this totally depends. If you are wanting to be in contact with somebody who is in the middle of launching a Kickstarter, good luck with that. Not going to happen. That's a booked and busy kind of time of one's life. But, you can send out inquiries and say, I'm interested in your game, or better yet, I'm teaching your game and I'd love you to come in, either virtually or otherwise. So the first time I taught Thousand Year Old Vampire, Tim Hutchings very kindly zoomed in, and Tim, like many actual designers in the space, also works or dabbles in academia, and so already knew kind of the deal. That can be really handy, and some people, it's clear who has ties to academia, either past or present, and many it's not, but you'd be surprised how many game designers, and indeed some actual play performers, end up, doing this kind of work, where they're tabletop, it's important to remember, is almost no one's full-time job. At least, especially if you're talking about actual players. If you're talking about like game designers, there's some game designers who are working for full-time for companies like Wizards and Paizo, but a lot of the space is contract labor. A lot of the space is doing that kind of multitasking. That means that their scheduling can be challenging, but it also means that this potentially is something that feels generative. So many of us end up doing work in isolation a lot of the time, or the feedback that we're getting is just notes from employers or corrections. And so having people who have an appreciative and deeply engaged mindset, like if you're teaching a game, is valuable. And so I encourage you to try to find, in the same way that networking is not as much about kind of climbing up the ladder to find a mentor, it's much more lateral networking is the most effective. Who are the people who are kind of doing what you're doing and are about the same stage? And that can mean lots of different kinds of things, for different folks. And of course, it gets a little wiggly when you're comparing, kind of teacher seniority to designer seniority. But, you know, the way I would put it, and this is really hard for me to say, so forgive me, um, I'm a pretty highly visible person in this very specific niche, which means that, uh, my reach is a little bit more, capacious than, than someone who's cold emailing who doesn't have, kind of, a visible presence. One of the things that you are going to want to make sure that you can do when you're contacting anybody, no matter how big or small, about participating in your classroom, or in your project or things like that, is make sure that you're somehow verifiable, findable. Also, if you can avoid using a Gmail account, I can tell you that one of the challenges of, at least my positionality, is I have to check my spam folder a fair amount of time because my stupid institutional spam filters filter out Gmail. That's not as true, for everybody that you might contact, but just be aware that if you haven't been able to reach somebody, your message may not have gotten to them, especially if you've kind of found an email address to email directly compared to an email form. The other thing to realize is that, um, some people are not like discoverable for a reason. A lot, and then some people work through agents, some people work through word of mouth. So a lot of what I do, is try to make the experiences that my guests that I have are the best possible experiences because, first of all, because it's the right thing to do. They're your guest. You're welcoming them into a hospitable space, which is the space of your classroom. Um, but also, if that doesn't convince you, then how about this? Everyone talks, man. Everyone talks. This is true of every field I've ever been in. If you are pleasant and give someone a good experience and treat them decently and don't screw them over and don't seem like you're using them as an instrument, my God, the bar's on the floor, but but that's actually something that people are looking for and prize a great deal in this space. Conversely, if you are rude or a jerk or or you waste people's time or you are belligerent when you ask people, or, all of those sorts of things, congratulations. No one wants to work with that. And it may not be tomorrow, it may not be the day after tomorrow, but soon people will be aware that you're kind of a dick and that they don't want to work with you. And that's also, I mean, that's true, and that's not the kind of, I don't wanna turn this into, respectability politics. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like, just basic human decency. So it's not like, did you write a thank you note, or did you speak in the right way or any of those kinds of bullshit things. It is literally, did you treat the other person, who are you're interacting with, as a person, to the best of your ability, whether you can pay them or not, whether it was 30 minutes of their time or an hour or whatever. Um, you know, I'm realizing more and more how incredibly important it is to behave, to act as a decent human being. Not because I've personally had bad experiences. I should just note everyone I've encountered has been reasonably decent. But I now, am a little pitcher with big ears and hear, all of the ways in which that is comparatively rare. So part of this is, you're building trust over time. So it may not be this class, it may not be this semester. And I wouldn't hound people, necessarily. Um, if I have to explain the why of how my class ended up being a class where people want to go, it's not because I teach this class to 120 students and it's like a captive audience for people to perform in. It's 12 people, maybe 14 if my research students come. And it's not even necessarily the like, I have a strong social media presence in that way. But I think that it is, in the sense that, like, the work, like, if you're doing work in public, even if it's not perfect, and this is something that Gabe was saying to my students last week, it's like, you try the thing, you do the thing, whatever it is, the thing that you're doing. If you're doing it in public, and you're visible, in doing the thing, then that's what allows people to kind of figure out how they might contribute or connect. And that's true for me of my teaching and research. That's true of other people for their creative endeavors more broadly. Um, so yeah, so I mean, in the same way that my advice to people who want to help is, be patient, because I only teach this class once a year, and so it's a kind of hurry up and wait in a lot of ways. It's either I need you tomorrow or I'll see you in a year. Um, Similarly, patience is necessary if you're the one doing the asking. Um, and I encourage you to cultivate an enthusiasm and an interest in folks beyond the kind of obvious names, because there are so many other incredibly wonderful and talented people in this space who are thoughtful, who have all kinds of stories and lessons learned, and often are going to be even more candid than some other folks. Remember that the other paradox of the space is, with success comes higher visibility and often more constraint. The bigger the company, even if you own it, the more that you feel a responsibility, and the more eyes you have on you. So, if what you're wanting for your students is, a real in depth thought about design thinking and about that aspect of the work, then I would look and see who's going to be at Metatopia, running games or thinking about games. I would look to see, folks who are submitting to Analog Game Studies Journal, in those kinds of ways. And cast your net in those spaces, to look for those kinds of interlocutors. For performance, you can, in the same way that you can for kind of highly visible people, go to something like Adventuring Academy or, Running the Game, or those kinds of venues, to see if you can get that information and bring it to your students in those beautifully produced bite-sized chunks. Um, you can start watching virtual panels, that are produced by cons like PAX and Analog Game Studies Generation Analog, which is here on the YouTube, and other spaces, to see, who's speaking on those kinds of panels in ways that you'd like, for your students to be able to be in conversation with, because a class visit is not a performance, not really. It In its best form, it's a conversation, and it's a conversation that gives to both parties. It gives, uh, validation and attention, but also new frames of thinking to the guest, and the guest is doing the same in turn. And it's a beautiful thing, and I really love being able to do it. And I cherish just as much, the folks who, maybe you're not like, maybe my students aren't screaming, crying, throwing up about, as the kind of big names in the space, who can't walk 10 feet at Gen Con without getting tackled. Um, which is its own fascinating experience that I would actually love to talk to folks more about, but probably not in the space of class. The other thing to realize in all of this is that there's a time and a place for different kinds of questions, and each of our positionalities can ask those questions in different ways. And as I have many positionalities within me, I can tell you that depending on my who I am in that moment and the role that I'm playing in a given exchange, there are questions that Emily M. Friedman of Polygon can ask, and some that she can't. There are questions that Dr. Friedman can ask, that and some that maybe she can't. And there are questions that, if I've grown to a place of trust and true community with someone, I can ask, with the knowledge that that might like, never be recorded or in front of an audience or known to an audience at all. It may just help me better understand the forum as a whole. This is why, for those of you who haven't seen my presentation for Big Bad Con, one of the things that I talk about in the interview protocol that I'm starting to run is giving people a transcript that then asks them, which of these parts am I citing? You by name, the name that you choose. Which of these parts are you comfortable with being quoted directly but not by name? And which of these parts do you want me to hold on to and keep safe until I see a pattern of people saying the same thing? So it's a verifiable thing that can be traced to no one individual. And those are and what people are willing to say in those different spaces are very, very different. And Dr. Friedman holds herself very closely to honoring that. So what M hears is functionally off the record unless otherwise specified. What Dr. Friedman hears becomes part of a negotiation, and what M. Friedman, the Polygon journalist, I follow journalistic rules in those kinds of ways. So that is a little bit far afield, but we are at 45 minutes of me nattering on about what it's like to have guests. Guests are super fun. Feed them a lot if they come to visit you. We have a university hotel right across from where I teach, which is really handy in downtown Auburn. Um, oh, before I forget, oh my gosh, I cannot finish this office hour without some important protocols, especially if you have somebody coming in person. But I also follow these, as you might have seen on my socials when someone's virtual, because even Zoom bombing can happen, even though we keep addresses pretty locked down and things like that. It's important to remember that um, a lot of people in this space, big and small, have experience with various kinds of stalking or various kinds of personal threat. This is also true, incidentally, for if you're hosting academics or other folks who have specialties that are sensitive. So if you're inviting somebody who has a specialty, especially in these days around race and ethnicity, around other kinds of justice topics, this is also something to think about. Um, you will never know, generally speaking, that someone is a guest in my class and the precise dates of their coming and going until they have already left. In fact, this happened to me on socials just the other day. Someone saying, "Oh, if I'd only known that so and so was going to be physically in Auburn, I would have been physically in Auburn." And I don't know if that person had a relationship to the person that they were talking to online or whether it was just a kind of overly familiar kind of thing, but that's not what we're here for. And so one of the important safety protocols is, yeah, we take photos and sometimes we record and, and I will absolutely thank people on socials for the gift of their time, but only when they're comfortable with that um, being made available. So, for example, Josh very publicly was going to Dragon Con and is not like someone who has had those kinds of experiences. And so we were a little bit looser about when we shared that he'd been here. Same with Ned Donovan, who's not currently kind of a huge name, although he works for a very big project and is the producer of a very big project. Um, we said nothing about, when Gabe was arriving and leaving, until his plane had landed elsewhere, um, and that's really important, because, again, you just don't know, and you can't know. I mean, you can have a safety conversation, and I encourage you to do so with speakers, um, and hopefully you won't let a speaker just have to bring it up themselves, but it's important to know that a lot of folks, even people who don't have especially large followings, have different kinds of safety protocols in place that we should make sure to honor. And the baseline expectation is just like, you know, don't uh, try to make it difficult for folks to know that where the person is at any given time. Don't post photos until someone's not there. In the case of a town the size of my university town, that functionally means, like, if I was in Los Angeles, I would probably be a little bit more flexible about, like, if someone had been in a building and not, we wouldn't post until they were out of the building, but, like, the fact that they were in the building, like, they could be anywhere in Los Angeles after that. If you're coming to Auburn, it's a real small town with a downtown of a block. We gotta be a bit more vigilant about, when folks are coming and going. And again, if they're posting to socials, then they can do whatever they want, but this is a basic security thing. I can't believe I left it to the end of this video that probably people aren't gonna get to the end to, but I cannot stress enough, like, this is a basic safety thing that you really gotta think about, if you're going to be the kind of person who gets trusted with, kind of people's time. The same goes virtually, honestly. Um, be very careful who you're sharing Zoom links with and in what spaces. In the case of today's class visit, it was given to my two research students and posted on Canvas for my class. My I didn't let my colleagues, have access to it or anything along those lines. If we were doing a larger event, first of all, at that point, you should be compensating the person, if you're not already. Matt very kindly volunteered his time. He will be getting a thank you package sent to Crit Roll Studios. Um, but you know, the bigger the event, the more careful you're gonna wanna be. Zoom bombings happen. They're more likely to happen with folks who are, either much in demand or, um, working on sensitive issues that rile people up in some way, shape, or form. And that's truer than ever now. So if you're hosting a bigger class than, say, 12 students, then one of the things you're going to want to think about is moderation, and whether you need that as part of the kind of packet. If it's a publicly accessible event of any size, you want to make sure you've got a mod in the mix. If you're doing even a virtual event, it's part of the safety protocol, and it can't just be you. It needs to be somebody who's, can pay full attention to what's happening in the chat, who might even be just letting people in off of a sign-in list, one by one, all those sorts of things. Um, Again, this is part of building trust. This is part of the work that we're doing. If you want to be a part of this, you are asking to be part of an intentional field and set of communities. It's not one community, it's many. But you are making the implicit kind of statement that you can be trusted to with, you know, with things like email addresses, possibly with people's Zoom presences, in some cases, you know, phone numbers, all those, this sensitive material. And so you need to act as though need to act in a way that is aligned with being uh, being worthy of that trust. And again, this is why, as we come to the end of the office hour, that much of what I've been talking about is not like, well, and first you write this kind of email and you send this kind of pitch. Um, because I hate to break it to you, most of the people have invited themselves um, to my class. So that's part of the challenge. There's not one right way to do this. And I don't know that I'm a good model. What I can clarify is um, a little bit of the ecosystem in which these kinds of offers are happening, and it's a mutual ecosystem. um and mutuality can take lots of different forms, so I don't want to I in the same way that I can't tell a graduate student today, you know, the way to become an expert in actual play is to start by being an 18th centuryist. Like, no, that the path is a weirdo path. Everything I do is a kind of a weirdo path. What I hope that I've been able to share at least today and elsewhere is a little bit of information about the circumstances in which I do my labor in the hopes that folks can say, okay, well, I don't have that, but I have this. I don't want to do this, but I want to do this. In a way that allows you to take the raw, to, in the spirit of analog games, take the stuff that I'm doing and remix the particular rules with the ground rules of always have safety tools, always have a kind of sense of respect at the table, all those sorts of kind of baseline things. I mean, that's what it comes down to is you're inviting people to a table. And I didn't anticipate any of this when I started. I'm not bullshitting you when I say that. And in some ways, that has been part of the common cause that I find with many of my guests for in very strange and lovely ways. So, thank you. If you are actually listening to this whole thing asynchronously, after the end of it, hey, that's fabulous. Happy to answer questions in the comments below or on any of my socials. As always, I am Friede on all the things that look like Twitter used to look like as a general rule. Thanks, Clint. You're awesome. You get a gold star and super XP for being with us, with me, just me today. Um, and I am Critical Prof here and on Instagram until I get a better name. Somehow this feels like it needs a change, but for now, that's what I do. This is where I am. We've got so much cool stuff in the works, and not all of it with big famous names, and that's awesome as well. So on Thursday, I'll be talking about how my students reacted. And their stars and wishes for the rest of the semester, and where we are now that we've been talking about all of our plans for unessays and talk about what's ahead. Until then, it's been lovely to talk about this thing that is a super cool and wonderful part of my work. Have a super great rest of your day, and I'll see you on Thursday.